Well, so there's this passage in Romans 9. Well, it's not the only reason, I should say, but I have real trouble with this, and I think it's still hard for me to say I think this is evil, but I think this is evil.
I think the importance that I really want to emphasize is when we say that we believe that the claims of the Calvinistic system, if logically and consistently applied, misrepresent the character and the goodness of God, then we should stand up against it. We should call it out for what it is.
Absolutely.
We should understand that Calvinists aren't intentionally doing this, but nevertheless, it's still damaging. It has its impact. And as you said there that we just read, this can and often does lead people to abandon the faith. We've played clips in the past of Derek Webb and other former Calvinists who have left the faith altogether and have become atheists, and they directly quote and cite Calvinistic interpretations of the text as their reasons to rejecting God and the concept and idea of God. Now, facts don't care about your feelings. I mean, Calvinists, whether you agree with Calvinism or not, you can't deny the fact that there are thousands of people throughout history of the church, the Christian church, who have come to believe that the Bible does teach Calvinism and have rejected the Bible on those bases. That's just a fact of the matter. One popular example of this is Megan Phelps. And this is just a 3-minute clip. I couldn't find the original. I could only find my video of it. And so I want us to watch this 3-minute clip of Megan Phelps, who she has Romans 9 memorized. She doesn't have any notes in front of her, as you'll see here. And she's quoting verbatim Romans 9 because she was a part of a very hyper Calvinistic congregation called Westboro Baptist, who are horribly bad people altogether. But nevertheless, she left not only Westboro Baptist, she left Christianity altogether, and let her explain to you why. Listen.
Why does God allow that?
So this is why I'm not a Christian anymore.
Oh, you got confused, and you're like, "What the?"
Well, so there's this passage in Romans 9. Well, it's not the only reason, I should say, but I have real trouble with this, and I think it's still hard for me to say I think this is evil, but I think this is evil. There's this passage in Romans 9 that talks about it gives this analogy of God as potter and humans as clay in his hands, and it uses the example of Jacob and Esau, who in the Bible, Jacob and Esau were twins. And it says, while they were yet in the womb, before either of them had done good or evil, God loved Jacob and hated Esau. And so it paints this picture of God, it says, what if God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath made for destruction. So it says God created some people as vessels of mercy, people that he loves, and others as vessels of wrath made for destruction. So made for the express purpose of destroying them, of torturing them in hell for eternity. So it's Paul who's writing, he paints this picture, God making you do all of the things that you do, and then blessing some and cursing others. And he says, well, you're going to ask me then, why does God yet find fault? For who has resisted his will? Right? So if God's making you do it, why is he punishing you for it?
Right. If God's making you do a horrible thing and you resist his will.
You can't resist his will.
Right.
And so he makes you do it and then he punishes you for it. And the answer is, you don't get to ask that question.
Oh.
It says, nay, but O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? You just don't get to ask that question. And to me, I've asked, I spent a long time talking to Christians and, people mostly Christians, because it's New Testament. So, but also talking to Jewish people about the Old Testament, and found so many of the interpretations, so many of our beliefs they're not fully supported by the Bible, and that there are so many different ways of interpreting so many of the more destructive of our beliefs. But that one, I have not found any explanation for that passage that's anything that makes any kind of sense, that's consistent with the text and not evil. And I thought I couldn't ask that question for so long when I was at the church, right? I thought I just have to accept this is the truth, and nothing that I feel or think matters against it. But now I can't not think.
Of course.
I cannot ask the questions.
I cannot ask the question, but ask the questions. Wow. When I hear that, that's when the rubber meets the road for me, at least when it comes to confronting this misinterpretation of Romans 9.
Yeah, it's the crux of the issue. Hey, I'd send her a book if she would read it. It's unfortunate because
I reached out.
that
I
is
tried to
the
reach
very
out to
issue.
her. I was just going to say I tried to reach out to her through various means to say send her my book as well, or have her on the podcast, and had no luck at doing so because I so desperately want her to recognize there are much better, valuable interpretations of Romans 9 than what you just offered, and hopefully she'll hear that. But go ahead.
Well,
Sorry to interrupt you there.
the other problem with that. Now, think about all the people that watched that interview, and they came away unbelievers. Now they came away with an understanding that that is what Romans 9 teaches when it doesn't teach that. And so, if I was an unbeliever sitting out there, I'd say, well, I don't know. Maybe I guess I'm a sinner. I'm living in sin. I'm probably one of those that's just made for destruction, and it becomes destructive. So that's what I mean when I address in the book the problem where people, when they misrepresent God, which she is doing by misrepresenting the text, because she's been taught that way at that church, which obviously is pretty extreme. But she's been taught well enough that she can certainly quote Romans 9, and she understands at least their hyper-Calvinistic interpretation of it. But yet, listen, I've read the exact same thing in very well-educated, Calvinistic commentaries that I have on my shelf here. I mean, they say the same thing, So, I mean, we almost, in a sense, can't blame Westboro Baptist too much. I'm sure she's got other issues besides that because of how they operate. But I mean, look, I could hand her a couple of commentaries off my shelf and she could come to the same conclusion and say, well, I don't want anything to do with a God like that. And that's my issue. And so there has to be a balance put back out there, and there has to be good answers. It's kind of like apologetics. I mean, you do apologetics. You're the director of it, right? For Texas Baptist. So if there is really bad thinking out there, there's poor philosophy, there's people's thinking is broken. They can't really line up anything logically. And so apologetics helps people think straight. I mean, God designed us like that. He made us in his image. Logic is grounded in the nature of God. And then because of that, we cannot help approach everything in a reasonable fashion because that's how he's designed us. We're made like that. So we obviously have to approach the Bible like that. If we don't approach the Bible like that and we start kind of making up these different ways of thinking that make no sense and are not logical, well, of course, we're going to come away from the Bible with something much different than what it says.
Well, you've written a book on Romans 9. And so if you had a Megan Phelps or someone like Megan Phelps in the room who just walked you through Romans 9 the way that she did, saying that, well, obviously this seems pretty evil of God to do this. He created people for destruction, which, by the way, that's not just a claim of Megan Phelps about Calvinism. That is a claim of John Calvin. I mean, let me just read a few of these points so that you can see them for yourself. We are not all created on equal condition. Rather, eternal life is foreordained for some, eternal damnation for others. That's a quote from John Calvin. He goes on to write, we say that God, once established by his eternal and unchangeable plan, those whom he long before determined once for all to receive into salvation. And so John Calvin, well, it goes on to say, salvation is freely offered to some, while others are barred from access to it. So this is not just Megan Phelps misrepresenting John Calvin. She's doing a fairly good job of representing exactly what Calvinists, at least John Calvin, says about Romans 9. Right. And so how would you reply to somebody in your church, maybe a Megan Phelps that goes, I'm out, I'm not doing church anymore. I'm reading Romans 9. I heard John Piper preach on it. I'm reading John Calvin's commentary. I'm out. I'm this is evil. I can't do anything I can't believe in a God like this. How do you respond to someone like that?
Well, I mean, obviously I would walk them through Romans 9. I mean, I'd try to get them into the context like I do in the book of Romans 8, in the fact that God has prepared our future. We have a future in glory. And then before he gets to chapter 12, where Paul is going to give you the therefore and give you the application section, the question on people's minds, especially for the people in Rome that were Jews, is like, well, but what about Israel? What happened to Israel? They trusted God too. I mean, Paul starts this concept back in Romans 3, and then he links it and pulls it into chapter 9. But obviously, Paul is talking about national Israel. I mean, if you go through Romans 9, 10, 11, they're dispensational chapters, but they're dealing with, yes, Israel was elected by God, Romans 9, and then they were given the task to serve God as a nation in a way that they would bring both the Word of God and the Messiah of God into the world. And so Paul starts to get into that, and obviously, if Paul has more concern for Israel being saved than God, that's a problem. So we're already off track at the beginning of Romans 9. But as we move through Romans 9, in a very simple way, it's easy to show that Paul is obviously dealing with the national aspect of Israel and how they were used, because by the end of the chapter, he makes the point that the reason that the Jews, which is really the topic of the chapter, it's dealing with Israel, they are the ones acting like Pharaoh. They're the ones in rebellion against God. They're the ones that actually, they handed the gospel to the world and they don't believe it. And so why are they not benefited from it? Because they are basing their relationship with God on their own self-righteousness, and they didn't come by faith. So Paul ends the chapter like that. Now, if you start the chapter dealing with Israel as a nation and Paul pleading that he almost give up his own salvation for the Jews, I mean, Paul obviously can't be more loving than God. And then if you end the chapter with the conclusion that's very clear that the gospel was always going to end up going out to the Gentiles. Paul gives the Old Testament quotes, and then he finally ends it by saying, well, the Gentiles benefited because why? Because they had faith. The Jews didn't. Why? Because they trusted their own works and self-righteousness. So they didn't take what is one of the main themes of Romans, which is the transfer or the imputation of righteousness by faith. So to come away with a conclusive interpretation in the middle of Romans 9 differently that flies in the face of that as just a basic 30,000 foot concept, then you already have problems. And so I would basically walk her through the verses and show that God is not choosing two individual boys, one of them for salvation and one of them for damnation. What Paul is doing is he's showing you the line of the Messiah. And the Messianic line went through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob. And then as Israel developed and then got to the place where they were now bringing the gospel into the world, not all Israel is Israel. A lot of people did not come by faith. Paul connects faith with promise. He contrasts faith with works. I mean, there's so many things that are in Romans 9 that help you realize and connect with the fact that what God is trying to emphasize is to Israel that they are acting no differently than Pharaoh was. And if you go back, which I do in the book, I think Godet is an excellent reference in this. He actually lists out the verses, which I quote him on that, to show that even in Romans 9, when Paul is dealing with Pharaoh, I make the point, talking about interpretive principles, that you have to go back when a New Testament writer quotes the Old Testament and find out the context of which it was written in. Now, Paul obviously understood the context of Exodus very well, and the quote that he brings over into Romans 9 from Exodus is dealing with the fact that, yes, Pharaoh resisted God, but before God hardened Pharaoh's heart, he hardened his own a number of times. And then God basically allowed him, or basically judged him in that state. And look, God judges time morally. He gave a lot of time for the Amorites, for their iniquity to fill up while Israel was down in Egypt. So as God brings Israel through this process where they need to believe the gospel, why did they stumble? I mean, you look at Paul's sermon in the book of Acts, and he's up finally in Jerusalem, the riot. He finally gets to the place where he can share the gospel with his own countrymen. He's all excited. And, you know, as you're walking through and he's given his testimony, he says, and God told me to go to the Gentiles. And it's even Luke says, when he said that word, that was it. It was all done. It was a huge riot. They said, away with this guy. He's not fit to live. I mean, talk about cancel culture. They're trying to cancel Paul immediately. So, you know, it's just, you can't harmonize the Bible if you isolate Romans 9 and take a Calvinistic leaning on it. It really doesn't make any sense, because when you actually go back, even Pharaoh himself, God could have destroyed Pharaoh right away. He didn't. The mere fact, it's no different than the book of Jonah, the mere fact, or the tribulation period, if God is judging and bringing judgment and it's a process, then people have time to repent. And so as God laid out 10 plagues in Egypt against the 10 different gods that he selected, those people in Egypt had an opportunity to see that they were not worshiping the true and the living God. They were worshiping false gods, because obviously God was winning the contest. So we get to the place when we deal with any kind of judgment, including the judgment on Pharaoh, that there is a point, because God says he's merciful. You know, he is long suffering. He tells us that in Exodus. So if God is merciful, he's long suffering. We watch him patiently dealing with the world, and we look at him actually patiently dealing with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And there were Egyptians that came out that got saved. They were redeemed on the Passover night. But Pharaoh, he resisted. And so it was to his own destruction. But God didn't select him. But God did, interestingly enough, use that scenario, knowing ahead of time that Pharaoh would reject him. He even told Moses that prophetically at the beginning of the book. And then by the time Pharaoh resisted, it gave God great opportunity to make his name known throughout the world. And everybody knows the Exodus story. It's just that everybody doesn't know it necessarily in its proper context, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think oftentimes whenever these, and I'm hearing myself back in my ears for some reason for the very first time, sometimes it does that after a long time of not talking. So it's gone away now. So anyway, I think what you mentioned about the nation of Israel is really important here. And I remember as a Calvinist, I remember somebody bringing that up to me, that, well, it's about nations, it's about Israel. And I would reply by saying, well, nations are made up of individuals, and so that's just more people. And so it doesn't get away from the problem. And I say, plus Jacob is an individual, Esau is an individual, Pharaoh is an individual. All of these are individuals that Paul mentions in specific. And therefore I thought I had defeated that argument by just suggesting that these individuals are mentioned. Therefore it's not about individuals. It must be about it must be more about individuals, not about nations. And so the reason I bring that back up is because I remember as a Calvinist never really dealing with the corporate arguments that you just made, because I misunderstood those arguments to mean, well, therefore individuals are not in view at all. And that's not what we're trying to say. Obviously Esau is an individual. Obviously Jacob is an individual. They're individuals who represent their nations that are in their womb, or so to speak. Two nations are in your womb, as it says in Genesis. And Pharaoh also is a type. He's a representative of one who was hardened to bring about the first Passover, in the same way that Israel, ironically, was hardened to bring about the second Passover. And so, yeah, he is an individual, but he's representative of a concept and idea, not of creating somebody for destruction, but of showing patience and long suffering for certain individuals or nations for a long period of time, holding out his hands to them for long periods of time, but eventually using them in their rebellion, hardening them or strengthening them in their resolve to bring about a good redemptive purpose through their acts of rebellion. And who are you, oh man, to question God if he takes and uses already rebellious, marred lumps of clay and shapes it and molds it into vessels that he uses for his good purposes? Who are you to question God if he does this? That's the point Paul is making. And when you understand that, Calvinism has no ground anymore. There's no reason to even entertain the idea of Calvinism once you understand that concept.